Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our lecture here online at the Museum of Wisconsin Art in West Bend. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Graham Reed. I'm the Director of Exhibitions here at the Museum of Wisconsin Art. And the impetus for tonight's talk is our exhibition Artists Without Borders, which is now on view at the museum in West Bend in the Hyde, Hurricane and West Bend Mutual Insurance Atrium. And it's on view here until July 4th. And we also have it at our St. Kate Hotel location in downtown Milwaukee until August 1st. And it features the work of 9 artists: Faisal Abduallah, Nina Ganbarjadeh, David Najib Kassir, Francisco Mora, Nirmal Raja, Gabrielle Tesfaye, Jason Yi, Rina Yun, and Zhao Yong Zhang. 7 different countries in the 9 artists. And it raises issues of place and identity, home and familiarity, as 7 of these artists have all emigrated from different countries to settle in the United States and become artists here and make their lives here. Every one of them is now a Wisconsin artist, but the issue of immigration, settlement, and assimilation still looms large. Tonight's guest requires little introduction, I'm sure, for many of you, but I will introduce him anyway. And he'll be guiding us through a history of immigration to Milwaukee in a talk entitled Neighbors and Strangers, The Challenges of Diversity in the Milwaukee Area. John Gurda is a Milwaukee-born writer and historian who has been studying his hometown since 1972. He's the author of 22 books, including The Making of Milwaukee, the first full-length history of the community published since 1948, and Milwaukee, City of Neighborhoods, a geographic companion that has quickly become the standard work on grassroots Milwaukee. Together, the books total more than 900 pages and feature 2,000 illustrations. The Making of Milwaukee was the basis for an Emmy Award-winning documentary series that premiered on Milwaukee Public Television in 2006. John's undergraduate degree is a Bachelor of Arts in English from Boston College, and he holds a Master of Arts in Cultural Geography and an honorary PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. In addition to his work as an author, he is a frequent speaker on Milwaukee topics, local history columnist for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and the bike riding historian on Milwaukee PBS's popular series Around the Corner with John McGivern. And the common thread in all of John's work is an understanding of history as why things are the way they are. This talk tonight is funded in part by a grant from the Wisconsin Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And John, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here and working with you again. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Graham, and pleasure to be back, even virtually. We'll do it in person again.
We will indeed.
Dealing with COVID. As Graham said, the show currently on display at the museum features the work of a diverse array of artists who trace their roots to countries all over the world by either birth or ancestry. And the common thread is not just diversity of expression, but diversity of background, diversity of cultural experiences. Diversity is certainly a strongly American theme and distinctly an urban theme. And that's true, certainly, in the Milwaukee area. Cities in every age and every place have always been kind of crossroads community. There were the kind of the currents of places all over the world kind of mix and mingle. Places where people come for opportunity, people come for socialization, and people come to establish a foothold. In many cases, fleeing poverty, persecution, other kinds of push factors from far abroad. So in Wisconsin, the urban place is certainly Milwaukee. Not that Delavan doesn't have Latinos, not that Wausau doesn't have Hmong, but Milwaukee is the place where you have this truly global diversity that marks the American people and certainly the larger state of Wisconsin, just beyond Milwaukee. So I'll be talking about diversity tonight, and there are a couple of ways of looking at it on 2 extremes. On one extreme, you can think about diversity as kind of this triumphal march, this pageant, this procession of different groups who come from very different places, but come to America and give what they have to the common pot. And kind of the image that stands out for me there is, for many years, the holiday folk fair, one of my favorite events, At the end of the dance performances, you'd have all the groups in costume, representatives, and they would pull this American flag taut. And the message was, here we are, all Americans. So that's one, a little softer view of diversity. On the other extreme, you can look at ethnic diversity or cultural diversity as kind of a cage match wrestling, where you have one group after another coming in, kind of looking down on those who follow and vying for supremacy in all sorts of fields of action. Where I fall is somewhere in between, kind of the triumphal march and the wrestling match. So I think of diversity in Milwaukee, America, and the world as kind of a combination of neighbors and strangers. So both of those dynamics are very present in the Milwaukee area. We certainly have world-class diversity, but we have not always had world-class harmony. Every group, in turn, has kind of elevated its own status by looking down on those who came later. At the same time, we celebrate our diversity. And you could literally, in non-COVID times, spend every weekend of the year attending ethnic events. So I want to tell the story of Milwaukee's diversity beginning at the beginning. And that certainly is the Native Americans. Obviously, when the ice melted here, it took a little while for the vegetation to reestablish itself. But going back thousands of years, this was the home of people of indigenous people, maybe with roots in Asia, but certainly from farther south and kind of moved in as the ice retreated. The anthropologists call the first arrivals Paleo-Indians, just means old Indians. What they call themselves, we have no idea. In historic times, the tribes who were here at the time of white contact were the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee. They were the ancestral tribes of all the dozen recognized tribes that make up native Wisconsin. And they were joined in the 1600s by Algonquian-speaking peoples from farther east. That included the Sauk, the Fox, the Huron, the Odawa, and most important, the Potawatomi, who are still here, and they're down there in the Menominee Valley. Next slide, Jennifer, please. We had, I should tell you, we were wrestling with the tech here for a couple of days, so this is kind of a digital manual presentation at the same time. The resources in Milwaukee were what brought the tribes here and kept them here. The woodland, the animals, and the wetlands. This certainly is a staple of Indian culture. Wild rice harvest in the fall of the year. And much of downtown Milwaukee was once underwater, and the Menominee Valley was the biggest wetland, not quite as large as the Horicon Marsh, but kind of approaching that scale. And it was a critically important source of building materials, of fish, of waterfowl, and of wild rice. The word Menomin or Menumin means wild rice in the Algonquin language family. So you have this a critically important source of nutrition. The physical welfare of countless generations of tribes going way back to the end of the Ice Age. The first people of European background who had contact with the natives were French-Canadian fur traders, and this was a slide of Solomon Juno, who came from a suburb of Montreal at the age of 14 or 15. It began as a voyageur, kind of these arduous voyages to the interior, lots and lots of portages. And in 1825, by that time he had matured, he'd grown out of the voyageur phase, and he and his wife Josette, who was part Menominee by ancestry, put their trading post on the corner of Water Street and Wisconsin Avenue in downtown Milwaukee. And that's the reason that today water in Wisconsin is still the commercial crossroads of Milwaukee. It's because Juno put his post there back in 1825, nearly 200 years ago. And the reason he put it there was it was on the first piece of dependably dry ground above the mouth of the Milwaukee River. Everything downstream was a swamp. So you have the Juno trading post being kind of the nexus of settlement in the fur trading period. And he was more honest, more fair with his native suppliers than many of the fur traders. At the same time, the fur trade had just an intensely disruptive impact on the native way of life. They had for millennia lived a subsistence way of life, living on the land, living off the land. With the advent of the fur trade, they were joined a market economy. They traded their furs, especially beaver, for the manufactured goods of the old world, coming from Montreal to Mackinac to Green Bay and on down to Milwaukee. So they were certainly in kind of a precarious balance for a number of decades, But then what happened was you had people coming from the East Coast who had urbanism on their minds. They were largely Yankee Yorkers, as they were called. People like this guy, his name was Byron Kilbourne. This is Byron's charm school graduation picture. He came here in 1834 from Ohio, but his roots are in Connecticut. He's a Connecticut-born Yankee. And the vast majority of Milwaukee's first urban dwellers, and the first land sale is 1835, so that's kind of the operative year of origin, were people from New York and New England, those Yankee Yorkers. The Erie Canal is kind of what brought them west. That opened back in 1825 and just unleashed this flood of settlers from the American East. So they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That was the first kind of ethnic pattern in Milwaukee after French Canadian and after Native American. There was quickly no more room for the natives who had made their homes here for so long. A couple of one-sided treaties back in the 1830s, in the phrase of the day, extinguished title to the land. And in 1838, those that remained were rounded up at what's now Forest Home Cemetery, a site the early whites called Indian Fields, and literally herded west to reservation land in Iowa. And when Iowa whites wanted that land, pushed farther west to Kansas. To this day, there are reservations of the so-called Prairie Potawatomi in eastern Kansas, who trace their ancestry to the same homeland that the Forest County Potawatomi do today. So certainly a massive diaspora dislocation of the native tribes and this first kind of neighbors and strangers dynamic. And what Byron Kilbourne and others saw here was the best natural harbor on the western shore of Lake Michigan, Chicago not accepted. So for those early years in the age of sail, having a harbor meant urban prosperity. So Chicago was a less commodious harbor and a whole lot more swampland. And for about 15 years, Milwaukee and Chicago were in a dead heat for population because Chicago's at a dead end. It's at a cul-de-sac. And what happened, 1852, the first railroad chugs into Chicago from the east, and wham, within a few years, Chicago was the freight handler to the nation in the line of the Carl Sandburg poem. And before too long was 4 times Milwaukee size and 5 times Milwaukee size. But Milwaukee continued to prosper as a port for the agricultural wealth of Wisconsin and the bordering states. And by the early 1860s, Milwaukee was the largest shipper of wheat on the planet. So it wasn't smokestacks that dominated the skyline, it was grain elevators. And the grain exchange, you now think of as a place for proms and weddings, that was the nerve center of the Milwaukee economy and a major player in the global grain trade. So you have a city growing as the result of great shipping resources, and that meant that it attracted people in many cases, in the majority of cases, people coming from abroad, especially from Europe. So the city is chartered in 1846, and only 4 years later, the census of 1850 shows that 64% of Milwaukee's population was foreign-born. Almost 2/3 of Milwaukee's population was foreign-born. So this has been a strong pattern in urban Milwaukee from the very beginning of its city history. And that was not quite off the charts, or later numbers were, but this was high in relation to other urban settlements. So by far the largest group in early Milwaukee was Germans, and that was absolutely true of West Bend as well. Those of you who know West Bend, the German culture there is still an extremely important part of the local culture. By 1860, Germans were a majority of Milwaukee's population. And to this day, there are about people of German ancestry, about 38% of Metro Milwaukee's population, including Washington County and West Bend area. And like all groups, they kind of clustered together. They try to maintain their cultural traditions, like this dramatic group with a picnic, beer steins and concertinas. A guy up in the top center got a beer barrel on his shoulder. So Gemütlichkeit was kind of the operative virtue here. And the main thing the Germans had in common was that they had nothing in common. Other groups were one stratum economically, one faith religiously, one persuasion politically. The Germans were just all over the map. So this is Old St. Mary's down on Broadway in Milwaukee before it became old. Maybe a third of the early Germans were Catholic. Another third were Lutheran of a wide variety of flavors. Others were Reformed. And there were, before the Civil War, there were 2 German Jewish synagogues. So there really was kind of a wild diversity of expression, religious expression among the German population. In terms of politics, there were certainly people who were quite doctrinaire. But Milwaukee attracted a lot of the so-called 48ers, the Achtung Vierziggers, who were educated, cultured intellectuals who had led a revolt against royal rule in the German states and suffered exile for their problems, for their trials. They came to places like Milwaukee, and the German Triangle, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Milwaukee were real destinations for them. And they founded the musical societies, the art societies. You got that great Von Maur picture painting at the museum as part of a really interesting period in Milwaukee's German cultural history. So Milwaukee, in contrast, in somewhat muted competition with the other German centers, became the self-proclaimed Deutsch Aachen of America, the German Athens of America. And one of the key institutions was the Turnverein, the Turner Hall. And turning meant gymnastics. And the main Turner Hall on 4th here, King of Melville Phillips, just north of State Street, was and certainly is a cherished landmark for Milwaukee. But this was, besides gymnastics, this was a place where people could meet for a beer and to talk. The Turners were an avowedly socialist organization, and over beers and pretzels, they're kind of these salon discussions of the issues of the day. And in many ways, the Turner Halls, this one especially, were kind of seedbeds of what became Milwaukee socialism. Others were intent on making a living, and that included the Brewers. They began as very small operations. Before the Civil War, there were 26 breweries. The first was started by Welsh, but all the rest were started by Germans. And this is Pabst that begins back in 1844. And it becomes the largest brewery in America just 30 years later in 1874. This is the scene as the beer wagons are about to make their morning rounds to the taverns around Milwaukee, which there were at the time probably around 2,000. In that same year, the Pabst was number 1, 1874. Blatz and Schlitz were in the top 12. So Milwaukee very quickly became the brewing capital of America. And where they lived, for the most part, was on the west side of Milwaukee's downtown, the so-called Kilburntown neighborhood. And North 3rd Street, now King Drive, was their downtown. King Drive, or 3rd Street back in those days, was second only to Grand Avenue or Wisconsin Avenue in retail sales volume. And there are stories from those days, perhaps apocryphal, stating that some merchants would put signs in their windows saying English spoken here, so they wouldn't scare away the occasional non-Teuton. So it was not just the Germans. The second largest group in early urban Milwaukee were the Irish. They were about 15% of Milwaukee's population. Back in 1850, they maintained their distance from the Germans as well as the other English speakers, the Yankee Yorkers, even have their own volunteer firefighting company. And there are, again, stories from the old days saying that those volunteer firefighting companies spent more time dousing each other than they did the flame, which was one good reason for Milwaukee to develop a full-time firefighting force. And where they lived, for the most part, was the 3rd Ward. This is a great 1886 lithograph of the bird's eye view of the 3rd Ward. And today, it's pretty high-toned real estate. Back then, it was anything but. This was a filled-in swamp, and it was known as the Bloody Third, which was a reputation that was associated with violence in the neighborhood. The 3rd Ward had the highest number of sometimes what they're called rum holes or thirst emporiums in Milwaukee in the day. The Irish also had the highest arrest rate in Milwaukee back when they were doing that kind of profiling. So the 3rd Ward was not a place you would have brought your out-of-town guests to show them the best that had the best Milwaukee had to offer. And as you can see from the torn overalls here, this was not by no means a wealthy community. These were people struggling kind of on the edge of poverty. But it was also certainly a very strong community in terms of its cohesion, especially political. We had a democratic machine that had an important influence on Milwaukee's public life. So you have, in the first decades of Milwaukee's urban experience, these so-called new immigrants, the German, the Irish, and to some extent the Scandinavian as well. And since they were a majority by 1850, they really kind of threw their weight around. They asserted their right to what they felt were liberal voting rights. And this alarmed the Yankee element. And during the 1843 debate, when the immigrants wanted to vote as soon as they got off the boat, the Milwaukee Sentinel, which was a Yankee organ published for Yankee readers, took exception to those demands. And here's what they said. If these foreigners, who are unlike ourselves in birth, language, breeding, and customs, secure equal rights with the Americans, our institutions will be seriously endangered. It is an injustice to draw these untutored monarchical barbarians out of their legitimate sphere and coddle them with fine things they do not understand. Already our population is more than half foreign-born. If they once gain the upper hand, our liberties are lost. You notice the distinction between Americans and foreigners there? So the Yankees were the Americans, the newcomers were the foreigners, and not making the grade, not part of the larger whole. And the Yankees succeeded in raising the time limit or the time tenure for voting franchise to 3 months and then 6 months over the objections of Milwaukee Schneiders and Murphys and Olsons. But importantly, Milwaukee was by no means an exclusively European city in those early years. There were African Americans here as early as 1835. A man named Joe Oliver was a cook who worked for Solomon Juneau and voted in Milwaukee's first election back in 1835. But permanent settlement starts with the arrival of this pair, who are Sully and Susanna Watson, who arrived in 1850. Sully had bought his own freedom. He came from Virginia to Columbus, Ohio, and then on to Milwaukee. And they became the patriarch and matriarch of a small but very cohesive Black community, numbering perhaps 100 people before the Civil War, lived in all parts of town, took a variety of occupations, owned property, and kind of added a different flavor to what many thought of as pretty much a European city. By 1869, there were enough Blacks in Milwaukee to organize a church, and St. Mark's African Methodist Episcopal Church was formed on the corner of 4th and Kilbourne. When you're downtown sometime and go around the Hyatt Hotel, there's a marker that shows the site of St. Mark's AME. And you think about the time here, 1869 is about 40 years before the Italians and the Greeks and other groups began to put down roots in Milwaukee. So the story goes back a lot farther than most of us realize. St. Mark's is, by definition, the oldest church in Milwaukee and still among the strongest Black churches, with headquarters now up on 16th and Atkinson. And so certainly there were strong institutions and there were some red letter events in abolitionist history as well. Milwaukee at the time and Wisconsin as well were strongholds of abolitionist sentiment. And back in 1850, Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Act as one of those attempts to kind of keep the Union stitched together, even though there was obvious secession trouble brewing. And what the Slave Act allowed was slave owners to come north onto northern soil and reclaim and recover their human property. This incensed abolitionists throughout the North. And in 1854, the man on the right here, Joshua Glover, he had escaped slavery in Missouri and found a home in Racine. His master came north with a sheriff in tow, arrested Glover, and hauled him off to jail in what is now Cathedral Square in Milwaukee. The man on the left is Sherman Booth, who was the editor of a newspaper called The Freeman, The Free Man, which continues publication as the Waukesha Freeman in our Western County. Little different editorial philosophy today. But he whipped his horse to a lather and rallied a reported 5,000 people to a protest rally on Cathedral Square. The crowd borrowed some timbers from the construction site of St. John's Cathedral, broke down the door of the jail, and Joshua Glover was whisked away and ultimately taken across the Great Lakes to Canada and freedom. And he ended up living to the age of 80-something in a suburb of Toronto. So at the same time this was going on, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and Wisconsin, recall, was just a stronghold of abolitionism. The Wisconsin State Supreme Court declared the Federal Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional. No one else did that. A state court declared a federal law unconstitutional. So it kind of gives you some notion of the passions and kind of a good precedent for more hopeful civil rights movements of the more recent past. So there were some certainly great events, but no one pretended that African Americans who followed Glover to Milwaukee were truly equal. There was actually a lynching in 1861 in the Third Ward when a couple of black residents were escorting a couple of white women. Third Ward resident took exception and they got into a knife fight. The Third Ward resident died, and the African American was hauled off to jail. And before he could be arraigned, much less tried, a crowd beat down the doors and hung him from a pile driver. So lynchings right here in Milwaukee back in 1861. So you have, though the times are changing in Milwaukee in the years after the Civil War, and the shift was from shipping to manufacturing, from agricultural products to manufactured goods. And the signature industry here was the Milwaukee Iron Company that opened in Bayview back in 1868. And it was, by 1875 or so, the second largest maker of railroad rails in the country, and by far the largest employer in the state. And what that meant was that you had all kinds of jobs as others followed suit. And these guys, these are skilled workers in the mill. These were the so-called puddlers who were among the skilled workers. These guys worked 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and they worked for $5 a day. And they were doing well. Their helpers made about $1.25, which, when you do the inflation multiplier, is about $2.50 an hour. So without a dime in fringe benefits. So very harsh conditions, but those conditions, despite being hot, heavy, and hazardous, they were much better than starving in the old country. So industrial jobs attracted industrial workers. And now you have a shift in the source areas of immigration from northern and Western Europe, the German states, the British Isles, Scandinavia, to Southern and Eastern Europe. And the two largest groups came in on that wave, the so-called new immigrants, were Poles and Italians. So here's a typically large Polish family. And where they lived for the most part was on Milwaukee's south side. And just as North 3rd was the German downtown, Mitchell Street became the Polish downtown, known in some circles as the Polish Grand Avenue. They were heavily Catholic as a group. And in 1866, they established St. Stanislaus Church as the first Polish church in any American city. And the mother church of around 20 congregations around town, including St. Josephs Basilica, which was built in 1901 with materials salvaged from the Chicago post office. This would have been a LEED platinum building had there been such an honor back in those years. It is a green building made of recycled materials. And it wasn't just the old South Side. You have Jones Island out there in Milwaukee Harbor that by 1900 was an urban village of roughly 1,600 people who made their living as commercial fisherfolk. And back in about 2013, the Museum of Wisconsin Art did a wonderful show that Graham curated on the art of Jones Island. It's the best I think I've ever seen. And I had a long-standing interest in Jones Island, did my master's thesis on it back in the 70s. So it was certainly an unusual settlement. But there were other ethnic groups who came around at the same time, and that includes the Italians. And in Milwaukee, Italian pretty much means Sicilian. This is the Busalacchi family, who later do quite well in the macaroni business. And they certainly were merchants, but most people in the beginning began working with their backs and their hands. The ones who aspired to their own businesses often began in industries with low barriers to entry. And that included wholesale or retail fresh fruits and vegetables. So they begin with hand-drawn carts, graduate to horse-drawn carts. This is Tony Mackey. His family still runs a produce business in Milwaukee. And the most successful would have their own wholesale houses on Commission Row, which is what Broadway in the Third Ward was known as for many years. And like the Italians, or like the Poles rather, like the Irish, they were very heavily Catholic. And in 1905, they established Our Lady of Pompeii on Jackson Street, and that was the hub around which the life of the community pretty much revolved. And this lasted until 1969, when it was torn down to make way for the expressway, not long after being declared Milwaukee's first official landmark. Didn't do it a whole lot of good. So the Italian Third Ward, Sicilian Third Ward, was one kind of early ghetto. There was another one not too far away, and that was the Haymarket neighborhood. And the picture you're looking at here is right on the site of the Fiserv Forum. So where the Bucks are playing these days. And in the upper center background, that's St. John's Lutheran, a building still there. The congregation still there as well, a little smaller. This had begun as a very intensely German neighborhood. In the 1880s, it became the center of community for Eastern European Jews from all the old Russian Empire. It wasn't just Russians. And they, by roughly 1900, they had maybe a square mile of hand-me-down houses that housed 5,000 people, and there were 12 synagogues on the site. So this was just extremely dense. And among the more celebrated arrivals there was a young girl named Goldie Munoz, who comes at the age of 8 back in 1908. And she becomes the valedictorian of the class of 1912. You can see here on the far right in this photograph. And the school she went to was called 4th District. It is now called Golda Meir School. And certainly Golda became probably Milwaukee's most famous ex-resident as the Prime Minister of Israel. And you have the community pretty much worshiping in synagogues in the area, but their shopping district was Walnut Street. That was their downtown, and kind of moved around the corner at North 3rd Street. So businesses like Rosenberg's clothing store and Gimbel's department store, German Jewish merchants, and serving a metropolitan clientele, but very much attached to the community in the old Haymarket neighborhood. As time went on, they moved north and west, and this is Beth Israel Synagogue up on Titonia, north of North Avenue, built for a reported $250,000 back in 1925. So there's progress. They're kind of moving up and moving out. But they also felt the sting of anti-Semitism. A lot of subdivisions had covenants saying that Jews were not allowed to buy property. A lot of summer resorts, including out in Washington County, the Lake District around Cedar Lake, would have no Jews allowed in their advertisements. And Mount Sinai Hospital, shown here, was organized back in 1903 as a hospital for everyone. But one of the driving forces in the establishment of Mount Sinai was to give Jewish physicians a place to practice when they were not welcome in the Christian hospitals. So this was a means of allowing them to practice their profession. So you have all these groups, large and small, and the smaller ones would range like the Slovaks, shown here down in Pigsville, a dramatic group or dance music group. And they were joined by other so-called new immigrants, the Serbs, the Greeks, Hungarians, Croatians, and Slovenes. And you have this flood of Southern Eastern Europeans, and this alarmed people who had been here even a little earlier, including the so-called old immigrants. And just to show you how kind of rabid, how overt, the racism could be back in those years, back in the 1920s, there was a man named Elwood Coverley, who was a Stanford dean and one of the most prominent educators in the United States. And he published a statement, kind of a study of ethnic groups in America. And what it amounted to was kind of libel against his fellow citizens. So here's his take on my ancestors and probably some of yours as well. The Southern and Eastern Europeans are of a very different type from the North Europeans who preceded them. Illiterate, docile, lacking in self-reliance and initiative, and not possessing the Anglo-Teutonic conceptions of law, order, and government. Their coming has served to dilute tremendously our national stock and to corrupt our civic life. So that's his judgment about people coming from places like Poland and Italy and other places in Eastern Europe. So before long, the older groups, some of them were experiencing trouble of their own as the 20th century wore on. You have Germany beginning the war, World War I in 1914. U.S. is neutral for a time. We jump in with both feet in 1917. And almost overnight, you have this hysterical propaganda campaign, and hysterical is the right word, that did its best to stamp out any vestige of not just sympathy, but identification with anything German. So the old stereotype of the culture German, Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, is replaced by this savage cartoon of the bloody Hun. Same time that ethnic cleansing goes on, sauerkraut becomes Liberty cabbage, hamburger becomes Salisbury steak. And in 1919, when the war was over, the Milwaukee Journal won a Pulitzer Prize for its attempts to kind of expose and denounce German sympathizers, not war sympathizers, but German sympathizers in Milwaukee. So just a few years later, in 1924, you have this kind of wave of xenophobia that washed over America after the war. League of Nations failed, among other things. And Congress in 24 passed the National Origins Act, which reflected the desire of people on American soil, even though they had immigrants in their own backgrounds, to raise the gangplank and deny entry to people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And precisely because, as that coverley statement had it, they were not assimilable. They were too different to be part of the American people. So that golden door, the Statue of Liberty poem, I lift my lamp beside the golden door, that door was slammed shut. And the impact that had was that industries were going really well after World War I in the 1920s. And Southern Eastern Europe had long been the source of less skilled labor for Milwaukee industries. So that door closed, another door opened, and now you had the first large-scale immigration as well of Latinos and African Americans. Latinos began to arrive back in 1920, and in the early years, they were largely imported by labor agents who were either trying to fill out threadbare workforces or break strikes, which was one pattern in the Milwaukee's tanneries. Pfister and Vogel was a major hirer of those labor agent-led flotillas of Mexicans coming up from south of the border. They were housed in company buildings for a time and educational programs to some degree. In time, they were joined by members of their families, sisters and wives and daughters. So the early arrivals were all the los primeros, as they called them, the pioneers, were largely guys. And as they saw these jobs seem to have some staying power, they formed families. And you have a relatively small but very coherent, very cohesive community of Milwaukee's near South Side around the Tannery District. So that's why today you have the best assortment of good Mexican restaurants in Walker's Point. It's because of jobs in those local tanneries. So they established institutions and newspapers, social clubs, and as was the case for all groups, a place of worship. In 1926, they established the Mission of Our Lady of Guadalupe and a storefront on 5th, just north of National. And here's a dedication. You can see the name in Spanish on the left. An army of altar boys, helps to dedicate this building, and its predecessor is still very much in operation just a few blocks away, Holy Trinity Guadalupe. And you have enough Mexicans in Milwaukee to celebrate Mexican Independence Day in fall of 1930 for the first time. So the celebration was held 90 years ago and moved from National to Mitchell, and now it's on Oklahoma. It shows you kind of the growth of Milwaukee's Latino community. And this was, again, they're making their way, but not without stereotyping, overt prejudice. In 1930, the YMCA, which was on their side, provided recreational programs, movie nights, and so on for the Mexican workers. And here's their one report from 1930, kind of their take on what the Mexican culture was. The Mexican is the victim of his mixed racial and cultural heritage, the plaything of primal forces which ever tend to neutralize each other into a personality often unworthy alike of his rich Spanish intensity and of his Indian simplicity. And another egregious stereotype. So you have, they trying to making their way upstream, against the tide of suspicion and distrust of newcomers. But those industrial jobs attracted an even larger number of African Americans. So that small community from Sully and Susanna Watson's day had grown slowly. But then the Great Migration begins, and the first stage is 1910 to 1930. In those 20 years in Milwaukee, hundreds of blacks became thousands of blacks, around 1,000 to around 7,500. And what attracted them was jobs. They often began on the entry level, like these asphalt workers working for the streetcar company, which we know today as We Energies. And they would graduate in time to industry. You see, this is an integrated workforce, lightly integrated workforce at the Falk plant. And what's shown here is a bond rally for World War I back in 1918. So they're finally earning factory wages in a factory town, and you have a genuine community forming with the growth and with the incomes as those advance with industrialization. And institutions, I love this photograph, certainly all groups have tended to cluster among those who look like them, who share their culture. At the same time, for African Americans, they were not welcome in most other sections of town. So institutions like St. MarksAME, this is when they were on 4th Street. This is the pastors surrounded by members of the Women's Fidelity. You have the YMCA on North Avenue, and this is the Carver High Y, and clean living, speech, athletics, and scholarship. So good to have those resources, but look at their headquarters. They're in an attic in an old building on the north side of Milwaukee. You have athletic leagues forming. This is the Milwaukee Urban League team. Goes back to 1919, so they're about 102 years old this year. And there were active businesses as well. This is a community drugstore on Walnut Street. You can see here they are kind of dressed up, perhaps a Sunday or for some other kind of celebration. So you have a self-contained, self kind of referential community. But this should be seen in context. Even though the black population grew between 1910 and 1930, they were still a very small proportion of Milwaukee's population. In 1930, they were just over 1% of the city of Milwaukee's population, compared to Chicago in the same year, 1930, 7%. So what I've argued is that in many ways, the Great Migration kind of much of it was absorbed by Chicago like this huge sponge, and Milwaukee became kind of a secondary destination until years later, back in the 1960s. So until 1970, Milwaukee had the lowest proportion of black residents of any major city in the U.S. So kind of that blend of genuine community, at the same time quite small. So as time went on, regardless of where you were from, the Depression really put a stopper to any kind of movement. Unemployment peaks at roughly 40% in 1930, and you have people losing their homes, losing their jobs and their homes. So you'd have these settlements called Hoovervilles on the outskirts of many U.S. cities. This is Estabrook Park in Milwaukee, a shanty town of the homeless. And what brought the economy off the mat was the buildup for World War II, and it began before we entered in 1941. Milwaukee, because of its industrial might, really became a critical supplier for the military. This is a scene inside the A.O. Smith plant. They didn't just make car and truck bodies. They also made seamless pipeline pipe, and someone had the bright idea, the epiphany, that if you crimp the ends of pipeline pipe, you got a bomb casing. So A.O. Smith provided 80% of the bomb casings for the Allies during World War II. Not the explosives, but the shells in which those explosives were packed. So you have, as the economy is going gangbusters in World War II, that keeps on expanding in the years after. So here's the welding shop at A.O. Smith, becomes integrated in the years after the war. And you have the black community rises with the rise of industrial jobs after World War II. And in many cases, they were hard, heavy, hazardous again, like the foundry work here at the Chalmers plant out there in West Allis. But what they did was they provided the foundation of a community that could support a business district. Here's the Near North Side Businessmen's Association from 1952. So things are looking up, but you also have poverty and blight, becoming an all too common experience for blacks who made their homes here. And you have this movement from the south to the north, and opportunities certainly, but also kind of a different version of some of the problems they'd known back home. Other kinds of problems surfaced in the 1960s. You have this freeway system that was more was planned than was built, but all the destruction was done. And here's a black couple standing on the side of their home that had been bulldozed for what's now Interstate 43, and the interstate certainly just put a major gash through the heart of that neighborhood, just as the 94 did through the heart of Milwaukee's near south side. So you have, as the community grows after 1970, and by 1970, we're up around 15% of the population. You have African Americans and their allies working to strike a better balance. A self-conscious civil rights movement gets organized, and the first cause was to stop desegregation in the schools. By 67, you have open housing being the cause, and a very unusual leader, Father James Groppe, emerged as the advisor for the NAACP Youth Council and became certainly a nationally known civil rights figure with other leaders, many African Americans as well. And in 1967, the NAACP Youth Council began 200 consecutive nights of marches for an open housing law in Milwaukee, and to demonstrate, that those demands, and they found a hostile reception in many sections of town, including the South Side. So there were attempts to kind of defuse some of those tensions, to redress some of the grievances, but all that discontent boiled over into violence on one warm night back in 1967, when Milwaukee became one of more than 100 U.S. cities to experience racial violence. It ended quickly, in large part because Mayor Meyer declared martial law, but the wounds lingered. The problem was that Meyer closed down the city and kind of magnified the fears, of people got their deer rifles out of their attics. And the problem was that when it was over, too many people, too many white Milwaukeeans thought of the end of the riot as a victory, not as a wake-up call to try to address some of those problems. As a result, they continued to fester. So all along, you have diversity becoming more and more a fact of life in Milwaukee in the years after the 60s. The Latino population continues to grow by leaps and bounds and has continued to the present. And today, to about 2/3 of the population is Mexican. But beginning after World War II, Puerto Ricans arrive as well, begin around the Cathedral Square as that area is urban renewed, move across to what's now River West, and down on Holton Street is where you find the bodegas and the closest thing to kind of a Puerto Rican community in Milwaukee today. You also have, by the 1970s, you've got an influx of people from Southeast Asia, especially the Hmong. And they had fought on our side in the Vietnam War. When we left in 1975, they were just hung out to dry, persecuted by the winning communist forces. We finally recognized our obligation to our former allies, and resettlement began. And interesting, the three states in rank order of population, Hmong population, are California, which you'd figure, be close to the Pacific, then Minnesota, then Wisconsin. So you have certainly Milwaukee is the largest, but places like Wausau and Sheboygan and La Crosse and Madison with large Hmong populations. And the reason is that you have Catholic and Lutheran resettlement agencies finding new homes for them. And those in turn were kind of rooted in the old European immigrant traditions. So kind of a nice kind of a generational payback going on there. And the story got more and more complicated. Muslims moved to the Milwaukee area. Palestinians, Pakistanis, Saudi Arabians, Indians, and Turks. They bought a closed MPS school on 20th and Layton back in 1982, and that is now the Islamic Center, which is one of the major one, but only one of many centers of worship and community for Milwaukee's Muslim community. And in much more recent years, there has been a continuing influx of people from all over the world, including Somalian refugees and some from Sub-Saharan Africa, and refugees from Myanmar as well. All of these groups, from the very early arrivals to the most recent, have struggled to adjust. They have all struggled to be accepted by the host society. But the struggles that came to define the city in some important ways were those faced by Milwaukee's largest minority group, which was the African Americans. By 1980, nearly 50% of Milwaukee's black males were working in manufacturing, compared to 41% of white males. So a higher proportion of blacks working in manufacturing than whites. At long last, they had broken through that ceiling, and they were working good jobs in a union town, being able to buy a second car and a house and send their kids on to school. And then, just almost overnight, the bottom fell out. A recession back in 1982 just gutted the manufacturing establishment. Chalmers here was the largest employer in the Milwaukee area, 20,000 workers there in the West Dallas campus. This is the last day on the tractor line. And African-American workers who had become accustomed finally to good wages lost those jobs. And nothing replaced them. Chalmers went bankrupt and the walls came tumbling down. And Chalmers was just the most conspicuous fatality. Tower Automotive, which took over the old A.O. Smith plant, they went bankrupt as well, closed the plant in 2006. 9,000 workers at one time had worked at A.O. Smith, many of them African-American. This is a man named Eddie Ballard who had put in 41 years at Smith, and you can't see it in the picture, but he's holding back tears at the loss of that job after so many years. So this is just 15 or 20 years of finally kind of breaking into the ranks of the manufacturing workers. And as nothing replaced those jobs, you have poverty rising to disastrous levels in Milwaukee's inner city. By 1986, the Black unemployment rate approached 26%, which is almost 3 times the metro average. And between 1980 and 1990, which were years of recovery for the rest of the economy, the proportion of Blacks living in poverty in Milwaukee rose from 28% to 42%. So it was just, things could not have been worse. Timing could not have been worse. Milwaukee's African-American community began young, arrived late, and had only a decade or two to establish themselves in good jobs. Then their roof caved in. The result was a structural handicap relative to other cities. The inner city economy was flattened and then frozen. And if you can't move out, you can't move up, you can't move out. And what that did was intensify patterns of segregation. So you have in Milwaukee today, and this is a pattern common throughout the urban north, 2010's block data, blue is white, green is Black, and yellow is Latino. And you have this wide swath of Black households on the north side, Latinos on the south side, which have been German on the north side and Polish on the south side. Red, little dots of red, are Hmong in the Midtown neighborhood and up in the northwest side. So you have this pattern of intense segregation. And Milwaukee certainly is among, I would not say the most, but among the most segregated cities in the country. But it is certainly an urban northern pattern. Here's Chicago. And look at the patterns here, kind of these alternating bands of white Latino, Black again, with that red concentration in Chinatown. So throughout the urban industrial north, places like Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Paul, Detroit, Cleveland, the pattern is pretty much the same. You have these flattened industrial economies that have really kind of left the minority communities, especially, kind of gasping for air, gasping for economic life. And we'll look at that on the smaller scale, the macro scale. This is a map shows the River West neighborhood on the right side of the heavy blue line, and the Harambe neighborhood on the left. And Holton Street is that dividing line, which is among the most vivid demographic separations in Milwaukee. For the most part, the area on the left is Black, and River West is largely white. And that color line is in existence despite the fact that River West is not just the most diverse neighborhood in Milwaukee, but among the most welcoming. They pride themselves on diversity and would certainly accept more. So why is there not more mixing on both sides? You look at a couple of numbers that really kind of answer that question. Roughly 74% of Harambe is Black, roughly 20% of River West is Black. So there's an imbalance there. But River West's housing values are 60% higher than Harambe's, and Harambe's household income is 40% lower. So what you're looking at is a fundamental lack of buying power. Economic isolation fuels social isolation, and so the gap grows wider and wider. That is by no means the whole story. There are thousands of lives that are going very well in the heart of town and the edges and suburbs as well. Halyard Park, couple shown here lives in Halyard Park, just north of the old Haymarket area. Suburban houses in everything but a dress, and certainly comfortable for the people who live there, but also kind of an act of faith in the surrounding neighborhood. So as all of us, and this is the last slide, as all of us in Milwaukee and elsewhere look out to an uncharted future, we are asking some large questions. We live clearly in a time of division, of polarization, of suspicion, of self-doubt, but also a time when there is a fresh awareness of some of the injustices kind of baked into the American system. And what goes on all through history is people asking the same question of different groups, and that is, why can't they be like us? It's one of the oldest questions in America. The early whites asked it of Native Americans. Why couldn't they adopt white ways? The Yankees asked it of the Germans and the Irish. The Germans and the Irish asked it of the Poles and Italians. And all those groups have asked it of Latinos, Asians, and African Americans. The fact that there are so many groups who were once considered they, who have become us, would suggest, I think, America's power to absorb differences. But there are always newcomers to question, always newcomers to place below us on the economic ladder. The challenge we face, and it's one common to all Americans, is to live up to an ideal that is as old as the Republic, to uphold a belief that many can become one without rejecting their heritage, that unity and diversity can coexist in a creative and energizing tension. That's a challenge for all Americans, for all of us, but it's also an opportunity that is as close as the person next door. There is, in the end, only one noun in this country, and that is American, but there are dozens of adjectives, from African to Belgian to Croatian to Danish, English, Filipino, German, on down the alphabet. It is our differences, mediated by our essential unity, that give this country its human appeal and its human power. We are neighbors and strangers, but together we pursue the American dream.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that illuminating and insightful presentation. See if we've got any questions.
Got dark out.
Yeah.
No one has any questions or comments or arguments?
Must have done such a good job. You've answered them all for everybody.
No, we're just overwhelmed them.
Yeah, I know Jones Island is always a very, as you say, you wrote your master's thesis on Jones Island, and when I did that exhibition, that was one of my principal sources of information. Well, I think we've frozen John. We'll give it another minute to see if any questions pop up. If not, we will say good night to everybody. Oh, Ken Buchholz, what happened to the Native Americans? Oh, there you are, John.
There. My apologies.
No, we just got a question. What happened to the Native Americans in Milwaukee?
They moved to the reservations in many cases. There actually now is probably a higher Native population in Milwaukee than there has been any time since the years pre-contact. The early years, the Potawatomi and others were, as I said, evicted, kind of moved to Iowa and then Kansas. Maybe an unknown proportion of that group kind of sat out that stampede and kind of melted into the forest as the removal was taking place. And they called them the strolling Potawatomi because they kind of stayed one step ahead of white settlement as the state of Wisconsin was settled. A lot of them ended up in Forest County. And in 1913, finally, this is decades, generations after their ancestors were removed, they were given reservation land in Forest County. And that's where they ended up. It's kind of a scattered reservation. It's not like the Menominee reservation. It's sort of very, very monolithic. And in 1991, they began to offer high-stakes bingo in Milwaukee in the Menominee Valley. And I've described that as kind of reclaiming your wealth one gambler at a time.
I have a question. It wasn't as if all the early settlers got on well with each other because there were the bridge wars, right? Between Kilbourne Town and Juneau Town.
Yep.
And they were literally firing cannons across the river at each other.
And those were Yankees. Those are people who kind of shared the same kind of linguistic, religious, political kind of feelings. And as is so often the case, it was all about money. It was the South Side was kind of a distant third because of a number of problems, including George Walker's laid-back personality and the fact that somebody jumped his claim. But Kilbourne and Juneau, Juneau's French Canadian, but he had, by that time, his settlement was pretty much overrun with Yankees. And each of them thought they could be the heart of the metropolis, and it's kind of what hurts you helps me, even though in time they both recognized that what helped one would help the other. So they finally joined forces. But yeah, it's kind of sort of comic opera. And whether or not a cannon was fired, is still a matter of debate. But certainly some noses were bloody. My favorite line, the Milwaukee Sentinels, the Bridge Wars, 1845. My favorite line was the Milwaukee Sentinel said, a number of combatants were considerably injured, though not dangerously. Blood was shed for the honor of Juneau Town and Kilbourne Town.
And Kilbourne Town was downtown west of the river, and Juneau Town was downtown east of the river, correct? Yep.
Juneau's cabin and post were on water in Wisconsin, and the west side was swampy too, so Byron Kilbourne's home was on 3rd and, ironically, Juneau, which back in those early years was Chestnut Street.
Oh, we have a question from Leslie Luttrell. Can you say more about Milwaukee socialists?
Sure. I can give you a whole talk about Milwaukee socialism. But just to kind of follow up on what I was saying about the early German establishment here, it was those 48ers who were kind of the intellectual forefathers and foremothers. There were very many number of women involved as well. Milwaukee socialism, and you have kind of this combination of German intellectual currents, and you see it today in the Social Democrats in Germany today, kind of the same kind of political philosophy, and just a huge population of working class voters who were alive to calls for working class solidarity. And you have malfeasance in high office. A guy named David Rose was mayor for about 10 years around the turn of the 20th century. And he was as crooked as the Kickapoo River. He was just all-night gambling dens. He cozied up to madams. Houses of prostitution flourished in the shadow of City Hall. So you had kind of those push factors of kind of malfeasance and the pull factors of kind of workers wanting to unite for a better, higher quality of life for themselves and their families. So it also took a genius of a tactician and kind of theoretician. Name was Victor Berger, who kind of united all these disparate movements and kind of turned them into an electoral juggernaut. He began to run candidates in 1998, and in 1910, Amos Seidel becomes the first socialist to govern a major American city, and that lasted until 1960 when Frank Seidler stepped down. So no city in the country has that record. And among other things, go ahead.
Who was it that got? Didn't Milwaukee send the first socialist to Congress in D.C. and they refused to seat him?
Yeah, that was Victor Berger. Yeah, he served. I think he served until the first year of Bernie Sanders' term.
And I think Victor Berger and Emil Seidel were both running mates for Eugene V. Debs, I believe.
But yeah, he was the perennial candidate for Socialist Party for mayor. But what happened with Berger was he was seated, so he served as the only socialist in Congress until Bernie Sanders came along. And then World War I, 1914, it starts, and he was editor of the Milwaukee Leader, which was a socialist paper. And in those early years of the war, Woodrow Wilson said that we are neutral in fact as well as in name. So a lot of Milwaukee Germans and West Bend Germans felt free to support the Kaiser's cause. So they were the home team back in those years. And then the U.S. jumps in 1917, and the Congress passes a sedition law, and again, this clamping down on dissent, this just coming down like a ton of bricks on any kind of sympathy for the Kaiser. So the Milwaukee Leader, because they were taking not pro-war, not pro-German editorials, but anti-war editorials. So it had its mailing privileges revoked by Congress, so he couldn't get anywhere. Dan Hone began to send it out under his own name. He put his own stamps on it, so they'd have circulation around the country. And Berger himself was prosecuted for sedition, and Congress would not seat him. So he comes home, and the voters in another election, they elect him again, and he's not seated again. So the Milwaukee voters say, it's kind of
I believe it was 1920. Eugene Debs ran from Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for president on the socialist ticket, and he was put there under the Sedition Act as well.
Yep. So interesting how things change. Mary Hunter wants to know, are there immigrant populations that have been shrinking in Milwaukee? And I think the immigrants, you have the early European immigrants, the Germans and the Irish. I wouldn't say shrinking, but I'd say assimilating. And there's been just a whole lot of intermarriage. The number of people of European background who are of anything like, quote, pure ancestry is getting smaller and smaller. I'm Polish and Norwegian, Polish on my dad's side, Norwegian on my mom's. My wife's all Norwegian, so there are few people around. But in that sense, that ethnic identification is dwindling. In terms of the actual population, the more recent immigrants, Latinos are growing the fastest. Southeast Asians are growing as well. New groups from Africa, from Myanmar, that population is growing. In terms of shrinking, I don't think anyone's really. I can't think of anyone who's left. I think there's been an awful lot of constancy. And what happened in Milwaukee in the 1990s, it became a majority minority city, like so many of the northern cities, and that's the result of the growth of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, as well as Native Americans.
Kristen Vollund, can you talk about the pattern of white flight and then gentrification in the city?
Yeah, it's kind of this sort of in some ways, not a conveyor belt, but kind of a loop in some ways. So you have, in the years after World War II, especially after the riot of '67, you have just an awful lot of white flight. This is going on around the entire country. You see it in Chicago, you see it in Cleveland, see it in the Twin Cities a bit later. So that was a clear and present pattern in all major northern cities. And what happened, as the Black population, Latino population kind of replaced the Europeans in the north and south sides, there was kind of this, in some ways, kind of a churning. And then there was kind of a movement of kind of looping back out from the urban edge back into the heart of the city. And that begins back in the 1970s, when you have people discovering a taste for exposed brick and open beams. The Third Ward had a whole lot of, which was just a kind of a bombed out old warehouse district before the 70s. So you have, that wasn't residential. There were, what was it, 1980, there were 84 people in the Third Ward. The whole Third Ward. So that wasn't gentrification. It was just kind of a reinvention of the Third Ward. But you have on the south side, the Walker's Point neighborhoods become hot. You have on the north side, Brewers Hill has certainly become hot. And that movement's kind of moving up to the north, across North Avenue into Harambe, those great old houses around First between North and Center. So gentrification, or in some cases re-gentrification in some of the older neighborhoods, it's been a real pattern. And in my view, it's kind of it's a two-edged sword. You want economic diversity in the city. You want people who can add to the tax base and have incomes that contribute to the larger way of life. At the same time, when you have people bidding up rents, people bidding up property values, that pushes a whole lot of pressure on long-time residents, including homeowners, who can't afford the taxes anymore. So it's a very delicate act, and there's been more than there were even 20 years ago. Certainly attempts to try to soften the effects of gentrification. Sort allow homeowners to stay in place and sort of have funds as developers kind of come in, to avoid displacement. So it's an interesting and certainly a strong phenomenon in Milwaukee and elsewhere.
Greg Smith, is there a Ku Klux Klan history in Milwaukee?
Yeah, there is, as there is in most northern cities. It began, it's kind of the start of Jim Crow in the South, when you have these vigilantes terrorizing the freed slaves in the South. And then it was kind of down there. And then in the 1920s, this goes right along with what I was talking about in the 20s, that the National Origins Act, when Congress was trying to keep out the Southern Eastern Europeans. So you have this outbreak of nativism, this outbreak of xenophobia, this outbreak of racism. And the KKK channeled an awful lot of those resentments. Indiana was the stronghold, the hotbed of KKK sentiment. And it spread throughout the cities of the urban north in the 1920s. Milwaukee had an active clavern. Madison had an active clavern. And there are these photographs, kind of horrifying photographs, the guys in the sheets and the cross burning in the background, holding parades in Milwaukee. And in those days, it was certainly anti-Black, but it was also anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic. So they were kind of equal opportunity bigots. And Dan Hone, who was a socialist mayor back in those years, the Klan was talking about having some kind of a convention or meeting in Milwaukee. And I can almost paraphrase his quote. He said, whether they terrorize someone who's Black, white, orange, or pink, the Klan who terrorize our citizens will find this the hottest city this side of hell. So he called them the Hoods and Nighties set. So he kind of ridiculing them, sort of trying to diminish their impact. And what happened, kind of throughout the urban north was it kind of died of its own way. It was juvenile. It was just juvenile kind of sentiments and juvenile antics. So as things got more prosperous, and as I guess the Depression may have really taken the wind out of its sails. But yes, there was an active movement here, as there was kind of throughout this entire upper Midwest.
Pat Bowen, in a new book, The Sum of Us, the author discusses communities that tore down their own amenities and abandoned middle-class building initiatives rather than desegregate them. Did Milwaukee do this also? What was the reason the socialist mayors were defeated?
I haven't read that book, but it's on my list. I have at least two friends recommend it. So I'm not aware of the dynamic that they're discussing. But I don't think it was like burning a village to save it. I think is kind of the operative the kind of model there. I don't think that happened much in Milwaukee. I think it was more abandonment, as they left the north side especially. And the socialist mayors were defeated, and this requires context. Frank Zeidler was mayor from 48 to 60, and he was a socialist. There was not one other single socialist in city government in elected office back in those years. So he was very much kind of a voice crying in the desert in a way. So there was no longer the electoral machine that there had been back in Berger's day. And what had happened was during the New Deal, the FDR Democrats co-opted the rhetoric, the strategy, and the programs of the Socialist Party, including Social Security. That was a socialist idea. A guy named Wilbur Cohen in Milwaukee was the father of Social Security. So you have, kind of the political death knell of socialism as an electoral force, and it becomes more kind of an intellectual stance and moral stance on the part of Frank Zeidler. He was, in those years, dangerously a staunch advocate of open housing, public housing, integration, and kind of people getting along with each other, people treating each other with respect. And the backlash he got was really pretty ugly. So he ran again in 52 and 56. I think 56 was the year. He was accused of putting billboards in the South urging blacks to come to Milwaukee, which was a complete fabrication. But it was kind of sort of tarring him with the brush, of of sympathy for African Americans and kind of the underdog. And that was, I think, Time magazine did a story called "The Shame of Milwaukee," which by no means, sentiments that were unique to this city, but kind of indicated what was going on, kind of underneath the surface. So it was not he was not defeated. He chose not to run. After 12 years, as being kind of this one man kind of crusade. It was tiring, very tiring. And he had 6 kids, so it was time to hang it up. And he spent 46 years not being there. No one has ever known or taught more about Milwaukee's history than Frank Zeidler. It's always been a hero of mine.
Jan and John Carroll, did the federal, state, and local governments play a role in this segregation of Milwaukee?
Absolutely, and that's true all around the United States. And you could, as they did back in those years, couch it in economic terms. But the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, the VA, Veterans Administration, after the war, they provided low-income loans or low-interest loans and federal guarantees to people who wanted to buy their own homes. But they drew red lines around neighborhoods where they would not lend, and those, by and large, were minority neighborhoods. So absolutely. So it was from their view, kind of protecting the investment, because these were, in many cases, substandard and blighted homes, but it had the impact of denying home ownership to an entire class of people. So yes, the government bears a lot of responsibility. The state level, not so much. The local level, Milwaukee was really slow to develop public housing, and that was kind of rooted in kind of a desire to keep blacks out. There's one landlord association leader who said that the only thing that's kept 1,000 blacks from coming to Milwaukee is the lack of public housing. So they really went slow, while Frank Zeidler was pushing for it. So Hillside Terrace, there just north of Fiserv Forum, that was the first public housing, not federal, post-war housing. There was a wonderful project called Garden Homes up in the north side back in 1923, and that was kind of for white working class families. So, but very, very limited public housing for years and years. And that's changed under kind of late Meyer, certainly in the Norquist as well. So that's been a different kind of mindset. But yes, that was part of the operative kind of machinery of government.
Okay.
I'm sure there must be other questions.
Well, we don't see another question popping up. So, John, I would like to thank you once again for your talk. Thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight. Thanks especially to the people who engaged John with a question. And as we say, this talk's funded by a grant from Wisconsin Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. John, thank you for your time. Thank you for helping us here at MOA, and I'm sure we'll work again with you in the near future. Thanks again. And thank you again, everybody, for watching. Good night.
Thank you, Graham. Thanks, everyone.